You've just arrived at History in Ashes, and I want to welcome you warmly to this journey. Here, we do not just skim through history's headlines. We pause, we listen, and we look at the overlooked corners where the quiet details live. Tonight, we're stepping into the years before the First World War, a time when Europe was humming with energy, wealth, and hidden cracks that no one could quite see until it was too late. Now, before we go any further, can I ask you something? Could you scroll down to the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is there right now? It's always fascinating to me how the echoes of history travel across time zones and continents. And while you're down there, let me make a little plea. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Think of it this way: armies in this story drafted millions of men into service without asking. I'm only asking politely for one small click. No muddy boots, no trench rations, just a button. Let's begin with something shocking. Europe before the war was, in many ways, at its peak. The early 1900s were known as the Belle Époque in France, a time of grand art, glittering cafes, booming industries, and what many believed was unshakable progress. Electricity was spreading, telephones connected voices across miles, and motor cars rattled along cobblestone streets. Cities glowed with optimism. Yet beneath that glow lay the machinery of nations arming themselves quietly, preparing for conflicts that seemed unthinkable in polite society. In those years, Europe was a patchwork quilt of empires, each stitched tightly with pride, ambition, and suspicion. The British Empire stretched across the seas, controlling lands so vast that people said the sun never set on it. France, still aching from its loss to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War a few decades earlier, watched nervously from across its borders. Germany itself was young and restless, eager to prove its power, its factories producing steel and coal at a pace that outstripped its neighbours. Then there was Austria-Hungary, a sprawling empire made up of many different peoples, held together with more tension than glue. Russia, massive and slow-moving, struggled with modernity, while the Ottoman Empire, once feared and mighty, was showing signs of decay. It was, in short, a crowded neighborhood where every house had guns under the bed and every family carried grudges from years past. Nations weren't just building armies for defense. They were locked in an arms race, producing dreadnought battleships, stockpiling artillery, and planning for wars that they swore they hoped would never come. But for the ordinary people, life in the years before 1914 felt both modern and old-fashioned. Farmers still bent their backs in the fields, children walked miles to school, and factory workers endured long shifts in dim-lit workshops. Yet, there were also marvels. Department stores filled with goods from around the world, moving pictures flickering across screens, and the miracle of flight-fragile airplanes made of wood and canvas, lifting off the ground for the very first time. It felt like humanity was stepping into a golden age, a time when progress would never stop. Hidden beneath this optimism, though, were divisions. The alliances that tied nations together were like ropes meant for security, but tightening into knots that would strangle the continent once the first spark was lit. Germany and Austria-Hungary had bound themselves tightly, with Italy joining reluctantly in what became known as the Triple Alliance. On the other side, France and Russia pledged to protect one another, later joined by Britain, forming the Triple Entente. These were not just handshakes, they were promises written in blood, agreements that if one country went to war, others would follow. Imagine for a moment the psychology of the time. Politicians often spoke in the language of glory, empire, and national honor. But for ordinary citizens, many did not fully grasp what such promises meant. A clerk in Vienna, a farmer in Normandy, or a shopkeeper in Berlin may have heard rumors of alliances and military parades, but few could imagine that within a few short years, their sons would be dragged into a war stretching across continents. The pace of everyday life carried on as if nothing dangerous lingered on the horizon. In London, people flocked to tea houses and music halls. In Paris, painters experimented with color and light, showing the world new ways of seeing. In Berlin, electric trams rattled through growing neighborhoods. In Vienna, Music spilled from cafes, where young artists and thinkers debated the future. To walk those streets in 1913 would have felt like living in a world that was racing ahead, untouched by the shadows that history was preparing. Yet, even in these moments of peace, signs of unease flickered. The Balkans, that rugged southeastern corner of Europe, was a region simmering with unrest. Small nations there, recently freed from Ottoman rule, were restless, nationalistic, and eager to prove themselves. Larger powers hovered over them like vultures, Russia claiming to protect its Slavic cousins, Austria-Hungary desperate to keep control over its restless territories. Each crisis in the Balkans seemed to blow over, but each left the world a little more fragile. For the military planners, though, war was not an unthinkable nightmare. It was a timetable. German generals had drawn up the Schlieffen Plan, a meticulous blueprint to defeat France quickly before turning east against Russia. France had its Plan 17, filled with optimism about storming into Alsace-Lorraine. These were not daydreams but serious calculations, carefully prepared on paper, waiting only for a trigger. And here lies the unsettling truth. While the people of Europe were toasting the dawn of a new century, their leaders were rehearsing a war that would consume millions. To give you a glimpse of what life looked like on the ground, a Parisian family in 1912 might gather in the evening to listen to a phonograph record, reading newspapers filled with gossip and stories of inventions. A German steelworker might spend 6 days a week in the factory, saving pennies to buy a better pair of boots. A Russian peasant might trudge through endless fields, burdened with taxes and little hope of change. None of them could have imagined that within just a few years, those boots, coins, and newspapers would be replaced by uniforms, rifles, and letters from the front lines. Looking back, it's tempting to say the war was inevitable. The alliances, the arms race, the rivalries, they all point to a continent marching toward disaster. But inevitability is always easier to see in hindsight. At the time, many believed war was impossible, that progress would win out, that nations were too modern and too civilized to slaughter each other again. They were wrong. So when we think about the world before the storm, we should remember it not as a calm before chaos, but as a moment when people were living full, ordinary lives, blind to the fire that was about to spread. And here is the thought I want to leave you with. How often in history have we mistaken the noise of progress for the silence of safety? When does optimism blind us to the dangers hidden beneath? The story of the First World War does not begin with armies or trenches, but with a single car ride on a summer morning. June 28th, 1914, was warm in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The streets were crowded with curious onlookers. Shopkeepers leaned from their doorways, and soldiers kept uneasy watch as the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, rode through the city with his wife Sophie. It is strange to think about how fragile history can be. The most devastating conflict the world had yet seen did not start with an invasion or a treaty, but with a misstep, a wrong turn, and the twitch of a young man's finger on a pistol. Sarajevo at that time was a tense place. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary a few years earlier, angering Serbia, which dreamed of creating a unified Slavic nation. Many in Serbia, and many Slavs within Austria-Hungary, saw the empire as an oppressor, keeping them from self-determination. Among them was a small group of young men belonging to a secret nationalist society known as the Black Hand. Their goal was simple and dangerous: to strike a blow against Austria-Hungary by assassinating Franz Ferdinand. The Archduke, for his part, was not universally loved even within his empire. He was seen as stiff and aloof, though he cared deeply for reforms that might have given more autonomy to the empire's restless minorities. In another life, his ideas might have reshaped Austria-Hungary into something more stable, but fate did not grant him that chance. As his motorcade moved through the streets of Sarajevo that morning, conspirators waited. The first assassin threw a grenade, but it bounced off the car's folded roof and exploded beneath another vehicle, injuring several officers and bystanders. The Archduke, shaken but unharmed, insisted on visiting the wounded in the hospital. This act of compassion would cost him his life. Here is where the absurdity of history reveals itself. The driver, unfamiliar with the city, made a wrong turn onto a side street. As the car reversed clumsily, it stalled directly in front of a cafe where one of the conspirators, Gavrilo Princip, happened to be standing. Princip had earlier failed to act, despairing that the plot was ruined. Yet now, by chance, the Archduke and his wife were stopped just a few feet from him. He raised his pistol, fired 2 shots, and in moments the world changed. Sophie was struck in the abdomen, Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Both would be dead within the hour. News of the assassination travelled quickly, carried by telegraph lines across the empire and beyond. At first, it seemed like a regional crisis, another Balkan quarrel that might flare and fade as others had. But this time, the alliances and rivalries of Europe turned a single act of violence into a global catastrophe. Austria-Hungary was furious, blaming Serbia for harboring the assassins and demanding justice. Serbia, backed by Russia, denied direct involvement but prepared for confrontation. Germany pledged support to Austria-Hungary, giving what historians call a blank check, a promise to stand by its ally no matter what. Russia, in turn, began to mobilize its massive army in defense of Serbia. France, tied to Russia by alliance, edged closer to war, while Britain, initially cautious, watched with unease as the situation spiraled. Here, we must pause to appreciate the machinery of alliances. These agreements, meant to deter war, now dragged nations into it. A quarrel between Austria-Hungary and Serbia might have been containable, but once Germany, Russia, France, and eventually Britain were involved, the stage was set for a continental inferno. The days after the assassination were filled with telegrams, diplomatic cables, and frantic meetings in royal courts and ministries. Leaders hesitated, threatened, reassured, and postured, yet none seemed able or willing to break the chain reaction. The Kaiser in Germany wrote letters to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, pleading for peace, even as his generals pressed for readiness. In Vienna, officials drafted an ultimatum to Serbia so harsh it was almost impossible to accept. In St. Petersburg, Russia debated whether to risk everything to defend Serbia. Each step was small, each decision seemingly logical to those making it, but together they built a staircase leading only downward into war. For ordinary people, these events seemed distant at first. A shopkeeper in London might read in the paper that an archduke had been killed in some far-off city he had never heard of. A farmer in the Russian countryside might catch rumors of mobilization without fully understanding what that meant. Yet within weeks, the lives of millions would be pulled into the orbit of this event. The symbolism of Sarajevo has haunted history ever since. It shows how fragile peace can be when nations are armed, alliances are rigid, and pride outweighs caution. If the driver had not taken the wrong turn, if Princip had gone home instead of waiting by that cafe, perhaps Europe might have remained at peace a while longer. But history is not built on ifs. It is built on moments where chance and preparation collide. Once Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, the machinery could not be stopped. Germany moved swiftly, declaring war on Russia, then on France, and launching its plan to invade through Belgium. Britain, outraged by the violation of Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. In a matter of days, the alliances had transformed a local assassination into a world war. This is the lesson buried in the dust of Sarajevo. History does not always need grand designs or years of planning to change its course. Sometimes it takes nothing more than a wrong turn and a pistol in the hands of a 19-year-old. As you reflect on this, consider how easily the balance of peace can tip. What small accidents in our own time could ignite consequences no one expects? How often do we mistake fragile arrangements for lasting stability? When the declarations of war began to flow across Europe in late July and early August of 1914, the continent seemed to transform almost overnight. Telegrams had barely finished crackling along their wires when men were called up, posters went up on walls, and the vast machinery of modern states began to move. What had begun as a distant crisis in the Balkans was now a war involving millions, and the first great shock was the speed with which mobilization unfolded. For the first time, Europe saw how trains, telegraphs, and the organization of the industrial age could turn a political decision into a military reality within days. In previous centuries, wars had been slower, armies mustering over weeks or months. But now, with railway timetables carefully plotted by generals in quiet offices, entire armies could be moved across countries in hours. Mobilization was no longer a slow march. It was a mechanical process. In Germany, notices were posted summoning men to their regiments. Families gathered in town squares as brass bands played, while young men in new uniforms marched with heads held high, cheered by crowds who believed the war would be short and glorious. Home by Christmas, many said. The German army, with its meticulous planning, moved with precision, loading troops onto trains that carried them westward toward Belgium and France. In France, mobilization was both solemn and enthusiastic. Farmers left their fields half-harvested, clerks put down their pens, and laborers set aside their tools. Many wept as they said goodbye to wives, children, and parents, but the belief in defending the nation's honor was strong. Posters with the word Mobilisation Générale appeared on walls, and church bells tolled across villages. For many French soldiers, the memory of losing Alsace and Lorraine to Germany decades earlier still burned, and now seemed the moment to reclaim what was lost. In Russia, the process was slower, but no less immense. The empire's sheer size meant mobilization was a colossal undertaking, with men summoned from distant villages across the vast plains. Some had never traveled far from home, yet now they were told to report for service, often with little understanding of the scale of what was unfolding. They crowded into wooden rail cars, carrying not only rifles but icons, charms, and the weight of their families' hopes. Britain, at first hesitant, now moved as well. Unlike the continental powers, Britain did not rely on conscription in those early days. Instead, volunteers flocked to recruiting stations, swept up by patriotic posters and speeches. Lord Kitchener's stern face, with his pointing finger and the words, "Your country needs you," became one of the most famous recruitment images in history. Young men lined up, some barely out of school, eager to prove themselves. Many lied about their age to join, their enthusiasm masking the grim reality of what awaited them. The mood in those first weeks was a mixture of fear and celebration. In cities across Europe, trains pulled out of stations to the cheers of crowds waving flags and handkerchiefs. Women pressed flowers into the hands of departing soldiers, kisses were stolen on platforms, and promises were made that this war would be quick, decisive, and glorious. Newspapers fanned the excitement, printing stirring editorials about honor, duty, and destiny. But behind the spectacle, there was also confusion and dread. Farmers worried about who would bring in the harvest. Mothers wondered how they would feed children without sons and husbands. In villages, the silence after the men departed was heavy, broken only by the tolling of church bells or the cries of children too young to understand why their fathers had left. The logistics of mobilization were staggering. In Germany alone, millions of men were moved across the country in just a few days. Each train was timed to the minute, each regiment assigned to specific rail lines, each station prepared to handle the flow of humanity. The precision was breathtaking, but it also meant that once the process began, it was nearly impossible to stop. This rigidity made diplomacy all but irrelevant. Once armies were in motion, the war was unavoidable. For the soldiers themselves, the first days often felt like an adventure. Uniforms were issued, rifles handed out, and men drilled in fields and barracks. Letters written in those early weeks are filled with excitement, with young recruits describing their eagerness to serve, their confidence that the war would be short, their curiosity about foreign lands they had never seen. They joked, sang songs, and told themselves they were part of something grand. Yet beneath the surface, there were already signs of strain. Supplies were rushed, uniforms sometimes ill-fitting, and many armies struggled with the sheer scale of feeding, clothing, and arming so many men at once. In Russia, Shortages of rifles meant some recruits were sent to the front with instructions to pick up weapons from the fallen. In Austria-Hungary, the complexity of managing a multi-ethnic army speaking many languages slowed the process. Even in Germany, whose planning was meticulous, there were moments when the scale of mobilization strained resources. For families left behind, life changed instantly. In France, women took over farms, managing harvests with fewer hands. In Britain, factories shifted toward producing uniforms, boots, and rifles. In Germany, families rationed food as blockades began to bite. Across the continent, children waved goodbye to fathers and brothers, then returned home to chores and responsibilities they were suddenly expected to shoulder. The trains that carried soldiers to the front also carried them into the unknown. Many recruits imagined battles that looked like the wars of their grandfathers' swift cavalry charges, bright uniforms, flags waving. Few could imagine the grim reality of machine guns, artillery barrages, and trenches that awaited. The gap between expectation and reality would soon be filled with blood and mud. One striking detail often overlooked is the sound of mobilization. Villages and towns echoed with the tramp of boots, the rumble of carts, and the whistle of trains. Church bells rang not for weddings or festivals, but for war. Newspapers rustled with lists of mobilized men, and conversations in markets and taverns turned to rumors and speculation. It was a cacophony of departure, the sound of millions leaving ordinary lives behind. In those first weeks, Europe was still intoxicated with the idea of a quick war. Politicians promised swift victories. Generals spoke of offensive spirit and morale. Families clung to the idea that their sons would return by Christmas. It was as if an entire continent was stepping onto a stage, unaware that the play they had entered would not be a short drama but a tragedy that stretched on for 4 long years. The reality of modern war had not yet revealed itself, but it was coming, carried on the rails and boots of millions. And here is the question I leave you with. What does it feel like to march into a war you do not understand, cheered on by your neighbors, unaware that the world you are leaving behind will never return? When the first soldiers reached the Western Front in late summer of 1914, they did not yet know that the war would stall and bury itself in the soil. At first, the war moved quickly. German armies swept through Belgium with speed and precision, following their plan to knock France out of the conflict before turning to face Russia. Belgian resistance was fierce, and civilians suffered under the occupation. But the German advance pressed on, clashing with French and British forces in a series of bloody early battles. The Battle of the Marne in September was the turning point. German troops had marched within sight of Paris, their boots echoing on French roads. But at the Marne River, French and British forces rallied. Taxicabs from Paris famously carried soldiers to the front, a symbol of desperation and determination. After days of brutal fighting, the Germans were forced to retreat. The dream of a quick victory was shattered. What came next was not a retreat in the old sense, but a digging in. Both sides began to entrench themselves, carving defenses into the earth. Soldiers clawed at the soil with shovels, picks, and bare hands, creating ditches that grew into complex systems of trenches. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a line of mud and barbed wire stretched across Europe. This was not planned. It emerged out of necessity, a response to modern firepower. Machine guns, artillery, and rifles made standing in the open almost suicidal. The only safety was to go underground. At first, the trenches were shallow, hurriedly dug pits. But as the stalemate continued, they deepened and expanded into elaborate networks. A typical trench system had a front line, a support line, and a reserve line, connected by communication trenches. There were dugouts for shelter, firing steps for shooting, and sandbags piled high, barbed wire coiled in front, designed to slow enemy attacks. Between the opposing lines lay the dreaded no man's land, a strip of blasted earth where nothing lived, littered with shell craters, broken trees, and the bodies of the fallen. Life in these trenches was unlike anything soldiers had imagined when they marched off to war. The ground was wet, often waterlogged. In many places, the soil would not drain, and men lived for weeks in mud that reached their knees. The stench was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, the sweet sick smell of death. Rats thrived, feeding on corpses and scraps, growing so bold they would scurry across sleeping men. Lice-infested uniforms, burrowing into seams and biting constantly. Sleep was broken by the crash of shells, the rattle of machine gun fire, or the sudden shriek of a whistle signaling an attack. Food was monotonous, hard biscuits, tins of meat, watery soup. Water was rationed, and soldiers drank from tins that often tasted of rust. Letters from home were treasured, small reminders of life beyond the mud. A photograph tucked into a pocket could mean more than any medal. Cigarettes and tea were luxuries that lifted spirits, traded as eagerly as currency. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers lived with the constant threat of sudden death. An artillery shell could obliterate a section of trench without warning. Snipers watched for the slightest movement above the parapet. Gas attacks introduced a new terror, clouds of chlorine drifting silently, burning lungs and eyes. Even when not under attack, the waiting itself gnawed at nerves. Soldiers wrote in diaries of the endless boredom, punctuated by bursts of horror, of counting the hours until the next bombardment, the next order to go over the top. Going over the top meant climbing out of the trench and charging across no man's land toward enemy lines. Men carried rifles, sometimes bayonets fixed, stumbling through mud and barbed wire while machine guns swept the field. Casualties were appalling. Entire units could be cut down in minutes. Survivors often crawled back to their trenches, shattered in body and mind. Yet the attacks continued, ordered again and again by generals who hoped for breakthroughs that rarely came. This new form of war bewildered those who had expected movement and decisive battles. Cavalry, once the pride of armies, was rendered nearly useless. Horses vulnerable to machine guns and barbed wire. The romantic images of gallant charges dissolved into mud and blood. War had become industrialized, a contest of factories, artillery shells, and human endurance. And yet, even in these conditions, soldiers found ways to cling to fragments of humanity. They carved small shelves into trench walls to hold photographs or letters. They brewed tea over makeshift stoves. They sang songs, told jokes, and shared stories of home. In the Christmas of 1914, soldiers on both sides in some sectors paused, sang carols, and even met in no man's land to exchange gifts. These fragile truces did not last, but they revealed the yearning for normalcy in the midst of destruction. The Western Front became a symbol of futility. Battles like Ypres, Verdun, and the Somme would follow, each claiming hundreds of thousands of lives for gains measured in yards. Generals struggled to adapt, caught between old doctrines of attack and the new reality of entrenched defense. The war ground on, a stalemate that consumed lives and resources at a pace never before seen. For those far from the front, news trickled home in letters and censored reports. Families read between the lines of carefully written notes, searching for signs of their loved one's true condition. Governments portrayed the war as noble and necessary, urging civilians to endure shortages and sacrifices. But as months turned into years, the gap between patriotic speeches and the reality of the trenches grew harder to ignore. To understand the Western Front is to confront the transformation of war itself. The optimism of 1914, the parades and songs, gave way to a new reality, a war of mud, machines, and mass death. It was not the quick adventure promised to eager recruits, but a long, grinding ordeal that would reshape the 20th century. And here is the thought I leave you with. What does it mean for a society when progress, the trains, the factories, the science, creates not a golden age, but a battlefield where men dig into the earth like moles, hiding from the very technology their world had celebrated? By the time the war settled into trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier, soldiers realized that this was not going to be a short adventure. The war had turned into a kind of waiting game, one where the days blurred together marked more by routine than by dramatic action. For the men who lived in the trenches, survival meant not just avoiding bullets and shells, but enduring the slow, grinding conditions of everyday life. If you picture a trench, do not think of a neat ditch cut into clean soil. Think instead of a scar gouged into the earth, filled with water, mud, and debris. After rain, the floor of the trench became a swamp. Soldiers stood for hours, sometimes days, in ankle-deep or knee-deep water. Their feet swelled, their boots rotted, and many developed what became known as trench foot, a painful condition where the skin softened and broke down, often leading to infection. In severe cases, gangrene set in, and toes or even whole feet had to be amputated. Prevention meant rubbing whale oil into the feet and changing socks as often as possible, but dry socks were rare luxuries. The mud was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. In some sectors, men drowned when they slipped into water-filled shell craters. A misstep at night could drag a soldier into slime that swallowed him whole. The trench walls, constantly collapsing under rain and bombardment, needed shoring up with wooden planks, sandbags, or sheets of corrugated iron. Even with constant repairs, many trenches sagged and stank, half shelter and half grave. The smell of the trenches was unforgettable, described in countless letters and diaries. It was a mixture of unwashed bodies, wet wool, tobacco smoke, and the sickly odour of decay. Corpses often lay just beyond the parapet, unreachable under fire, their presence a grim reminder of the danger outside. Rats thrived in this environment. They were not the timid creatures of fields and barns, but large, fat rodents feeding on the dead and multiplying in the dark corners of dugouts. Soldiers wrote of rats gnawing on bread loaves, scurrying over faces as men slept, and growing so bold that they barely flinched when kicked. Lice were another constant companion. No matter how often uniforms were boiled, lice returned, crawling in seams and biting at skin. The itching drove men to distraction. They scratched until their skin broke, leaving sores vulnerable to infection. Soldiers called it chatting when they sat together picking lice from their clothes, a grim but bonding ritual. And yet, despite this misery, routines formed. A soldier's day was marked by duties as regular as clockwork. At dawn, the most dangerous time for enemy attacks, men stood to arms, rifles ready, peering into the dim light across no man's land. Breakfast followed, usually tea, bread, and tinned meat or jam. Afterward came hours of maintenance, cleaning rifles, repairing trenches, hauling supplies. Fatigue parties carried sandbags, barbed wire, and ammunition through communication trenches, often under shell fire. Others fetched rations from supply depots, stumbling through the dark with steaming vats of stew or tea balanced on poles. Afternoons were quieter, filled with boredom and fatigue. Men wrote letters, mended socks, played cards, or simply slept if they could. In the evenings, supplies arrived under cover of darkness. At night, patrols ventured into no man's land, crawling through the mud to repair wire, scout enemy positions, or sometimes raid opposing trenches. Night was also when the dead were collected, when stretchers carried the wounded back, when the war whispered most cruelly in the dark. Meals were rarely satisfying. Soldiers grew sick of the monotony of rations. Tinned corned beef nicknamed bully beef, hard biscuits, and thin soup. When lucky, they received bread or fresh vegetables, but these were scarce. Tea was the lifeline, drunk whenever possible, strong and bitter, a taste of normality in a world gone mad. Alcohol, usually rum for the British or wine for the French, provided warmth and temporary escape. Illness was rampant. Aside from trench foot and lice infestations, soldiers suffered from dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation. Latrines were nothing more than shallow pits, quickly filling and overflowing. Flies swarmed, spreading disease from waste to food. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers in winter, while in summer, the heat bred clouds of flies and swarms of mosquitoes. But perhaps the most destructive illness was invisible, what soldiers called shell shock. Prolonged exposure to bombardments, sleepless nights, and the constant threat of death broke many men's nerves. Some trembled uncontrollably, others went mute. Some screamed uncontrollably, unable to return to the line. At the time, shell shock was poorly understood, sometimes dismissed as cowardice. Only later would it be recognized as a form of trauma. And yet, even within this misery, men found ways to endure. They carved small comforts out of the chaos. Soldiers decorated dugouts with scraps of wood, painting signs or names. They made shelves to hold candles, photographs, or keepsakes. Games of cards or dice passed the time. Songs filled the air, bawdy tunes or melancholy ballads reminding them of home. Humor thrived in the darkest places. Jokes about mud, about officers, about the absurdity of war. Laughter, even bitter laughter, was a weapon against despair. Letters from home were treasures, read and reread until the paper wore thin. Some carried pressed flowers, locks of hair, or small tokens. Soldiers replied with accounts carefully phrased to spare their families the truth, describing routine duties instead of horror. Censorship also played its part, with military authorities blacking out sensitive details. Still, the connection with home was vital, a reminder that the world outside the trenches still existed. Religion played a role for many. Chaplains visited the trenches, offering prayers, comfort, or simply a listening ear. Some soldiers carried small prayer books or crosses. Others clung to rituals touching lucky charms, saying the same words before going into battle, believing that small actions might ward off death. The bonds between soldiers, forged in these conditions, were profound. Men relied on one another not just for survival but for sanity. A shared cigarette, a helping hand, or a joke whispered in the dark could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. Soldiers spoke of their comrades as brothers, bound by experiences no one at home could truly understand. For those who rotated out of the front lines, life in the rear offered some relief. Hot meals, dry clothes, and sleep without fear of bombardment. Yet even in rest camps, the war was never far away. Artillery rumbled in the distance, and the knowledge that return to the trenches was inevitable hung over every moment. The rhythm of trench life, danger, boredom, discomfort, camaraderie, lasted not for days but for years. Generations of men spent their youth in the mud, their memories etched with the smell of damp earth, the crack of rifles, the whistle of shells. The horror of trench life is sometimes remembered only in statistics, in numbers of dead and wounded. But to understand it is to imagine the details. The cold mud squelching in boots, the itching of lice under a collar, the sound of a comrade snoring in a dugout, the bitter taste of tea in a tin mug. These were the realities that shaped the men of the Western Front, grinding them down, yet somehow, remarkably, leaving many still able to laugh, to sing, to dream of home. And here is the question I leave you with. When daily life itself becomes a battle against mud, rats, sickness, and fear, what does it mean to keep going? To find small sparks of humanity in the darkest places? As you leave behind the mud and trenches of the Western Front, you travel eastward, into a different world entirely. The Eastern Front was a place of vast plains, dense forests, and rivers that carved through landscapes far larger than those of Belgium or northern France. Here, the war moved differently, not stalled in trenches, but unfolding over hundreds of miles, in a series of battles that tested endurance, logistics, and sheer human stamina. In 1914, the Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south. It was a theatre defined by immensity, where armies of millions clashed across distances that would take days to traverse. Unlike the Western Front, where railways allowed for relatively organized supply lines, much of the Eastern Front was remote, with poor roads, few railways, and little infrastructure. For ordinary soldiers, this meant marches that could last weeks, carrying heavy packs through forests, across rivers, and over snow or mud. Russia, with its massive but poorly equipped army, was a central player here. Millions of Russian peasants were conscripted, many of them barely literate. and unfamiliar with modern military discipline. They were sent with rifles, often outdated, and minimal supplies. Clothing was a problem. Winter coats arrived late, boots wore out, and tents or shelter were scarce. Officers often relied on strict discipline to maintain order, but morale was fragile. For many soldiers, the war was not just a battle against the enemy, but a struggle to endure hunger, exhaustion, and the harsh environment. German and Austro-Hungarian forces, by contrast, were better equipped and organized. They used their rail networks to move troops efficiently and relied on artillery to dominate open fields. However, even they were challenged by the vast distances and unpredictable weather. Snowstorms, rain, and muddy terrain slowed advances. Rivers could become formidable obstacles. Bridges were often destroyed to slow enemy progress, and armies sometimes had to build their own crossings under fire. Battles on the Eastern Front often resembled movements across a giant chessboard. The Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914 is one of the most famous examples. Russian armies advanced into East Prussia, confident in their numbers, but unaware of the speed and coordination of German forces. Encircled and outmaneuvered, the Russian Second Army suffered devastating losses. The scale was enormous. Tens of thousands killed, captured, or wounded, and entire units wiped out. Unlike the Western Front, these were battles where terrain, distance, and mobility mattered as much as trenches and machine guns. Life for soldiers here was grueling. They marched for hours, often with insufficient food or water. Rivers had to be forded, forests crossed, and hills climbed while artillery boomed in the distance. Horses, essential for transport and cavalry, were overworked. Soldiers learned to improvise, building temporary shelters from tree branches, melting snow for water, and sharing meager rations among comrades. Clothing and equipment were constantly in disrepair, and winter was brutal, with temperatures dropping well below zero. Frostbite and exposure claimed many lives before the fighting even began. Disease was another invisible enemy. Typhus, dysentery, and influenza spread quickly in camps crowded with men from villages and towns all across Europe. Latrines were rudimentary, clean water was scarce, and hygiene was a daily struggle. Soldiers often carried lice, which multiplied endlessly in close quarters. Medical care was minimal, and surgeons worked under fire, improvising with whatever supplies they could scavenge or requisition. The Eastern Front was not just a war against other armies, it was a war against nature, distance, and the body itself. Civilians also suffered enormously. Unlike the relatively compact Western Front, battles on the Eastern Front swept across towns and villages. Homes were requisitioned for soldiers, crops were burned, livestock stolen, and populations displaced. Refugees moved by foot or cart, carrying what little they could save. Entire regions were depopulated or reduced to famine conditions. Letters from soldiers often mention the sight of starving families, fields stripped bare, and villages emptied of life. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield. Despite the hardships, soldiers developed strategies to survive. Camouflage became essential. Tents and positions were hidden among trees, and men covered themselves with mud to avoid detection. Scouts and cavalry patrols gathered information about enemy movements. Soldiers learned to forage for food in forests, hunt small animals, or barter with local populations. Shared knowledge of the terrain became as crucial as maps, for a single misstep could lead to capture or death. The vastness of the Eastern Front also created a sense of isolation. Unlike the Western Front, where soldiers could often hear artillery from nearby sectors or receive supplies relatively frequently, units in Russia and Galicia sometimes went weeks without communication. Letters home were delayed or lost, leaving families uncertain. Soldiers faced long marches to battlefields, with no guarantee of support or relief. This isolation amplified stress, yet it also forged intense camaraderie among units. Men depended on one another for food, warmth, and protection. Winter campaigns were particularly harsh. In 1915, Russian and Austro-Hungarian troops faced sub-zero temperatures in the Carpathians. Frostbite became as deadly as bullets. Snowstorms reduced visibility, and supply lines were frequently cut by ice or avalanche. Soldiers dug trenches in frozen soil, their shovels breaking on rock, their hands numb despite gloves. Fires were rare, and food often consisted of hard bread and salted meat. Survival depended on endurance, ingenuity, and sheer luck. The Eastern Front was also a theatre of innovation, though born of necessity. Engineers built temporary bridges, pontoon crossings, and makeshift railways to move troops. Cavalry remained relevant in many areas, using mobility to harass and outflank slower infantry. Artillery tactics evolved to manage long-range bombardments across open plains. Commanders learned to coordinate massive movements, sometimes involving hundreds of thousands of men in a single offensive. The scale was staggering. One of the lesser-known aspects of the Eastern Front was the role of intelligence and espionage. Scouts, informants, and local sympathizers played a crucial role in providing information about enemy movements. Messages were carried on horseback, on bicycles, or by runners. Delays or miscommunications could turn a minor engagement into disaster. Soldiers learned to read the landscape, interpret tracks, and anticipate enemy tactics. Survival often depended on perception and cunning as much as firepower. Amidst all this, small acts of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared rations, protected the weak, and sometimes helped civilians caught in the crossfire. Letters and diaries reveal moments of levity, a song sung around a campfire, a shared joke about officers, or an exchange of food and tobacco. Even in the vast expanse of hardship, men sought connection, humor, and glimpses of normal life. The Eastern Front also exposed the fragility of empires. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic state, struggled to manage its armies, where orders had to be given in multiple languages, and loyalty was often uncertain. Russia faced political and logistical chaos, with conscripts sometimes rebelling or deserting. Germany, though disciplined, had to stretch resources across a front larger than it could easily manage. The war revealed weaknesses that would have long-term consequences, not just for the outcome of battles but for the nations themselves. Despite the hardships and scale, the Eastern Front did not receive the same attention in history books as the Western Front. Yet its impact was profound. Millions of men died or were wounded, entire regions were devastated, and empires began to unravel. It was a war of endurance as much as strategy, where survival was measured not only in victories, but in the ability to march, fight, and endure over unimaginable distances and conditions. And here is the question I leave you with. How do ordinary people survive when the world around them stretches endlessly, and danger comes not only from the enemy, but from the ground beneath their feet, the weather above their heads, and the sheer weight of exhaustion pressing down every day? When you think of the First World War, you may picture mud, trenches, and endless fields of Europe. But another theatre of conflict stretched across the oceans, rivers, and coastal waters. A war of steel, steam, and secrecy that was just as deadly in its own way. The seas were not neutral. They became arenas of strategy, survival, and blockade, where nations attempted to strangle one another economically and militarily. From the earliest days of the conflict, the British Royal Navy exerted its dominance over the seas. Its goal was simple, yet devastating: to blockade Germany, cutting off supplies of food, fuel, and raw materials. Britain's fleet, the largest and most powerful in the world at the time, patrolled the North Sea, laying mines, intercepting merchant ships, and enforcing strict control over shipping lanes. For Germany, reliant on imported goods, this blockade would become a slow-acting weapon, starving both the military and civilians, long before armies faced one another on the battlefield. Germany, in turn, relied on a different approach, the U-boat or undersea boot. These submarines, small, stealthy, and lethal, patrolled the Atlantic and North Sea, seeking to disrupt Allied shipping. The U-boat campaign was one of the first examples of unrestricted submarine warfare. Merchant ships, carrying food and supplies, became legitimate targets. Entire convoys vanished beneath the waves. The goal was to force Britain to surrender by cutting off its lifelines. For sailors aboard these vessels, life was grueling and tense. U-boats were cramped, noisy, and dangerous. Diesel engines filled the interior with fumes, and torpedoes were both the weapon and the risk. Every dive was a gamble. Crew members lived shoulder to shoulder in damp, claustrophobic compartments with little light and almost no privacy. Food was limited, water rationed, and fresh air a rare luxury. Yet the sense of purpose and the thrill of stealth kept many aboard, despite the risks of depth charges, mines, and surface attacks. Merchant sailors faced their own perils. Ships crossing the Atlantic or the North Sea carried vital supplies for the war effort: grain, coal, meat, and equipment. Many were ordinary men, untrained in combat, suddenly thrust into a world of torpedoes, explosions, and freezing waters. Lifeboats were often overcrowded, survival at the mercy of the weather and the kindness of strangers. When ships were sunk, rescue could be hours or days away, depending on location. Entire crews sometimes vanished without a trace, swallowed by the sea. One of the most infamous incidents of naval warfare in this period involved the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915. A British ocean liner, carrying passengers and supplies from New York to Liverpool, was struck by a German torpedo off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people perished, including civilians, men, women, and children. News of the disaster spread shockwaves across the world, inflaming public opinion and drawing neutral nations, including the United States, closer to the conflict. It was a stark reminder that the war had no safe boundaries, and that even travel across the ocean carried lethal risk. Blockades and shortages were not abstract concepts. They shaped daily life. In Germany, by the winter of 1917, food had become scarce. Civilians faced hunger and malnutrition, rationed to barely enough to survive. Cooking fat was confiscated, bread was often a mixture of grains, and vegetables were nearly impossible to come by. Hospitals overflowed with children suffering from malnutrition, and families struggled to feed themselves. The blockade, silent and distant from the front lines, became as deadly as bullets for many. In Britain, the U-boat campaign created anxiety along the coasts. Convoys were organized to protect merchant shipping, with armed escorts traveling alongside cargo ships. Sailors and passengers learned to sleep in shifts, wear life jackets at all times, and drill for torpedo attacks. Letters from the time describe the nervous tension, the constant noise of depth charges, and the sudden bursts of panic when a torpedo was spotted. Civilians, too, felt the war in everyday life, adjusting travel plans and fearing the open sea. Naval intelligence played a vital role in this theatre. The British intercepted coded German communications, enabling them to reroute convoys and prepare ambushes. Germany, in turn, relied on spies, disguised supply ships, and secret bases along the Atlantic. Each side sought not just physical victory but strategic advantage, disrupting the enemy's economy, morale, and supply lines. The chessboard of the oceans was as intricate as any land battle. The war at sea also highlighted the human capacity for endurance under extreme conditions. Sailors faced stormy seas, cramped quarters, and the ever-present danger of drowning or attack. Submarine crews spent days submerged, navigating by periscope, hearing the creaks of their vessel and the thrum of engines, while knowing that a single depth charge could collapse the hull. Merchant sailors learned to keep calm as torpedoes struck nearby vessels, abandoning cargo and clinging to survival. In all cases, mental fortitude became as crucial as physical strength. One lesser-known aspect of naval warfare was the blockade's effect on neutral countries. Nations such as the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway struggled to maintain trade and avoid entanglement. Neutral ships were often inspected, delayed, or redirected. Smuggling became common. Civilian populations felt the indirect impact of naval strategies, as shortages of imported goods affected prices, diets, and daily life. In some cases, communities faced famine not because of fighting on their soil, but but because the sea, once a source of abundance, had become a deadly barrier. The psychological toll on sailors and civilians was immense. Anxiety, sleeplessness, and fear became constant companions. For those aboard submarines or ships under threat, every wave, every shadow, every echo could be mistaken for impending doom. Letters and memoirs describe men counting the hours until dawn, praying for safe passage, and clinging to small comforts. A warm cup of tea, a letter from home, a moment of humor in an otherwise grim situation. Naval battles also influenced strategy on land. The blockade of Germany weakened the Central Powers' ability to sustain their armies. Food shortages affected morale, health, and the capacity for prolonged offensives. In response, Germany intensified submarine attacks, hoping to force Britain to surrender before starvation took hold of their own forces. This cycle of action and reaction illustrates the interconnectedness of war at sea and on land, how the movement of ships, torpedoes, and supplies could determine the fate of entire nations. Despite the grim circumstances, sailors developed small rituals to endure. Music, games, and storytelling became vital. On U-boats, men passed the time with card games or songs. On merchant ships, humor and camaraderie provided brief relief from tension. These small acts of humanity were essential, creating mental space in a theater defined by danger and deprivation. The war at sea also brought innovation. Mines, depth charges, sonar experiments, and new types of torpedoes changed the rules of engagement. Naval engineering advanced at a remarkable pace as nations sought technological advantage to overcome blockades and U-boat threats. Submarines became faster, artillery more precise, and communication systems more sophisticated. Yet despite these innovations, the human element, courage, endurance, and improvisation remained the decisive factor in many engagements. By the end of 1917, the war at sea had exacted a heavy toll. Civilians in Germany were starving. Sailors had endured endless danger. Trade routes were disrupted, and the psychological impact on populations and armies alike was profound. The oceans had become a theater of suffering, strategy, and survival, influencing the course of the war as much as battles on land. And here is the question I leave you with. When survival depends not just on skill or courage, but on the vast, unpredictable expanse of ocean itself, how do humans cope with danger that is unseen, immense, and relentless? As you move away from the front lines, you enter the towns and villages of Europe, where war creeps not with artillery but with subtle, persistent pressures. Here, ordinary people faced a conflict that did not require rifles or bayonets, yet demanded endurance, ingenuity, and sacrifice. The war infiltrated every corner of life: markets, kitchens, factories, and schools, altering routines, expectations, and even relationships. One of the first impacts was food. Early in the war, governments anticipated disruptions but underestimated their severity. Bread, milk, butter, and meat became scarce. In Germany, the British blockade slowed imports, making wheat and flour limited commodities. Families stood in long queues, often waiting hours for meager rations. Housewives developed what came to be called ersatz foods, substitutes intended to stretch supplies. Coffee was replaced with roasted acorns or chicory, chocolate with vegetable extracts, and butter with margarine. Recipes became exercises in creativity, yet could never fully replace what was lost. Britain, too, faced the realities of scarcity. While the Royal Navy's blockade limited enemy access, the war strained domestic supplies. Government campaigns urged citizens to grow their own vegetables in victory gardens and to conserve meat, sugar, and other staples. Recipes were published emphasizing frugality, using leftovers to make soups or stews, and stretching ingredients to feed families. Children were enlisted into efforts to dig gardens or collect scrap metal for the war effort, making participation a civic duty from a young age. Rationing was both practical and psychological. Governments carefully calculated portions, issuing ration cards and monitoring compliance. Yet even with regulations, supply chains were fragile. Rail transport prioritized military needs, leaving fewer trains for civilian deliveries. Farmers faced labor shortages as sons and husbands joined the front, further reducing production. This meant that civilians, especially women, bore much of the burden, balancing household management with labor outside the home. Factories, too, transformed. With men away at the front, women entered industries in unprecedented numbers. They operated machinery, manufactured munitions, and worked long shifts in dangerous conditions. In Britain, women's contributions in munitions factories were crucial, but often overlooked in recognition and pay. Explosions, chemical exposure, and physical exhaustion became part of daily life. Yet these same women also carried the invisible burden of worry for fathers, brothers, and sons fighting far away. Propaganda emerged as a constant presence. Posters, newspapers, and public speeches sought to shape perception, maintain morale, and encourage participation. Patriotic images filled walls, soldiers smiling in uniform, flags waving, mothers bidding, sons farewell. Slogans emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice. Governments carefully curated news from the front lines, censoring defeats and exaggerating victories. In some countries, misinformation was as much a tool of war as rifles or artillery. Civilians were told not just that the war was necessary, but that their personal actions, rationing, gardening, volunteering, were acts of national heroism. Children, too, felt the encroachment of war. Schools taught patriotic lessons, sometimes using play to instill military ideals. Students participated in drives for scrap metal, rubber, and paper. Letters were encouraged to soldiers, with teachers emphasizing the importance of supporting the brave men at the front. Even young children became participants in the war effort, aware that survival at home depended on contribution, caution, and obedience. Disease became a silent threat on the home front. With malnutrition widespread in blockaded regions, immune systems weakened, and epidemics became more dangerous. Influenza, typhus, and other illnesses spread more easily in crowded urban centers or refugee camps. Hospitals were overwhelmed, not only with civilian patients, but also returning soldiers with wounds, frostbite, or disease. Families were often forced to care for the sick at home, improvising treatment when medical help was scarce. Economic pressures were constant. Inflation, caused by the redirection of resources to the military, reduced the value of wages. Families spent hours negotiating markets for scarce goods, bartering when money failed. Jobs for women offered income, but also exhaustion and physical risk. Farmers struggled with labor shortages and increased demand. Merchants contended with supply interruptions and rationing restrictions. Across the continent, survival required adaptability, resourcefulness, and endurance. Social life changed too. Weddings, funerals, and festivals were subdued or postponed. Communities developed new routines to cope with absences. Neighbors shared childcare, exchanged food, or collectively managed small farms. Postal service became a lifeline, connecting families to the front lines, and letter-writing skills became essential. Each envelope carried hope, reassurance, or warning, and the arrival of a letter could transform a day of worry into one of relief. Cultural life adapted as well. Theatre, music, and literature often took on patriotic themes. Newspapers published stories of heroism, sacrifice, and endurance. Humor persisted, sometimes dark and ironic, in letters and publications. Cartoons mocked the enemy, celebrated local resilience, or poked fun at bureaucratic regulations. Even in suffering, people sought laughter, art, and connection, preserving fragments of normality amidst chaos. Refugees and displaced populations added another layer of difficulty. Battles on both the eastern and western fronts displaced millions. Families fled, carrying possessions in carts or on foot, seeking safety in towns, countryside, or neutral countries. Camps and temporary shelters became crowded, disease-prone, and tense. Civilians had to navigate scarcity, fear, and the constant uncertainty of whether they would find food, shelter, or safety. Women's roles extended beyond work. They organized aid societies, drove ambulances, and managed hospitals. Some became nurses on the front lines, witnessing firsthand the brutality of wounds, infection, and death. Their diaries and letters often reveal a mixture of pride, exhaustion, and despair. For many, participation in war was not optional. It was a daily necessity for survival, community, and family welfare. The psychological effects of this sustained pressure were profound. Anxiety, grief, and fatigue became part of ordinary life. Families lived in constant fear for absent loved ones while struggling to maintain stability at home. Coping mechanisms varied: humor, superstition, religious devotion, or small routines. Children learned early that survival required compliance, creativity, and attention to detail. Adults carried the dual burden of providing and protecting, often under conditions of extreme scarcity. Even entertainment shifted to accommodate shortages and danger. People listened to music at home instead of attending crowded concerts. Community gatherings emphasized simplicity and patriotism. Stories circulated in neighborhoods, blending fact and rumor, teaching lessons about survival, heroism, or caution. Newsreels in cinemas showcase battles, often filtered through the lens of morale boosting, allowing civilians to witness war without leaving home but never showing the full horror. And yet, despite deprivation and fear, ordinary people demonstrated remarkable resilience. They found ways to stretch limited resources, maintain social networks, and protect one another. Meals were creatively prepared, clothing patched repeatedly, and homes fortified against scarcity or cold. Communities innovated, establishing collective gardens, bartering systems, and local aid networks. The war transformed life, but it did not extinguish the human drive to endure and adapt. Civilians also participated in the moral and psychological battle of war. Propaganda, censorship, and rumor were countered with personal judgment, skepticism, and cautious discussion. People learned to read between the lines of newspapers, compare letters, and develop informal intelligence networks. Survival required not just physical endurance, but mental acuity, resourcefulness, and social cooperation. The slow encroachment of war into civilian life illustrates a profound truth. Conflict is not confined to battlefields. The ordinary rhythms of work, family, and community are reshaped, often imperceptibly at first, until every meal, every journey, and every decision bears the imprint of conflict. Children, farmers, factory workers, and shopkeepers all become participants, their choices and sacrifices forming an invisible but vital front of war. And here is the question I leave you with. When war seeps into kitchens, classrooms, and neighborhoods, how do ordinary people continue to live, love, and laugh, knowing that survival depends on every careful choice, every rationed meal, and every small act of endurance? As you return to the battlefield, you notice a transformation. The war is no longer just a contest of men and strategy. It has become a test of technology, ingenuity, and adaptation. In the years from 1914 to 1918, the First World War evolved into a crucible of innovation, where every side sought an edge in firepower, mobility, and psychological impact. Ordinary soldiers, civilians, and even entire nations found themselves at the mercy of machines and chemicals they had never encountered before. Artillery had long been a part of warfare, but during this conflict, it became the dominant force on the battlefield. Heavy guns, often requiring teams of dozens to operate, could fire shells weighing hundreds of pounds over miles of terrain. Artillery barrages could flatten forests, obliterate trenches, and create landscapes unrecognizable as anything human. Soldiers learned to count the intervals between the flash of a gun and the sound of its boom, to estimate distance and timing, trying desperately to anticipate bombardments. Entire offensives could be launched or halted by artillery alone. The psychological effects of sustained shelling were profound. Soldiers described shell shock, an ailment that manifested in trembling, muteness, paralysis, or panic. It was the cumulative effect of constant exposure to explosions, shaking earth, and the knowledge that death could arrive from above without warning. Officers sometimes misunderstood these symptoms, calling them cowardice, but increasingly medical officers recognized them as trauma. Shelters and dugouts could only protect so much. The earth shook, windows shattered, and nerves frayed under relentless bombardment. In 1915, a new and horrifying weapon entered the war: poison gas. First used by German forces at the Second Battle of Ypres, chlorine gas drifted silently over the battlefield, yellow-green clouds rolling across trenches. Soldiers inhaled the chemical, their lungs burning, eyes tearing, and throats closing. Panic often spread faster than the gas itself. Masks were rudimentary at first, cloth soaked in urine or bicarbonate solutions pressed to the face, offering partial protection. Later, more sophisticated respirators were developed, but the fear of invisible, lingering death remained constant. Chemical warfare evolved rapidly. Phosgene, a heavier-than-air gas, followed chlorine, its effects slower but often fatal. Mustard gas, introduced later, caused blistering on skin, internal damage, and lingering suffering for weeks or months. Gas could linger in trenches, soak into clothing, and make areas uninhabitable for days. Soldiers learned to recognize wind direction, test for leaks, and prepare emergency responses. Yet despite precautions, thousands died or were injured, and the psychological terror became as significant as the physical threat. Tanks appeared on the Western Front in 1916. Early models were slow, cumbersome, and mechanically unreliable, yet their appearance marked a revolutionary shift. Covered in armor, moving on tracks that crushed barbed wire and small obstacles, tanks introduced mobility, where previously there was stalemate. They could cross no man's land, flatten wire, and provide some protection for infantry. Soldiers faced these machines with awe and fear. While early tanks broke down often, their mere presence altered tactics and morale, hinting at a mechanized future of warfare. Machine guns, although already in use, became central to the stalemate on the Western Front. Positioned in fortified bunkers or sandbagged emplacements, they could mow down waves of attacking soldiers in minutes. Entire battalions were decimated, attempting to cross a few hundred yards of open ground. Soldiers learned to move carefully, use terrain, dig small cover, and coordinate attacks to survive. For ordinary men, the machine gun was an almost invisible enemy, its rapid fire reducing human bodies to numbers on a casualty list. Aircraft became another theatre of innovation. Initially used for reconnaissance, planes evolved into fighters, bombers, and observation tools. Pilots flew fragile wooden and canvas machines, facing freezing temperatures, engine failures, and enemy fire. Aerial observation allowed artillery to target trenches with unprecedented accuracy, while dogfights became deadly duels of skill and courage. Civilians watching from below saw planes for the first time as weapons of war rather than curiosity or entertainment. Air raids over towns introduced terror to the home front, spreading fear far beyond the battlefield. Submarines, as mentioned earlier, became another technological threat, disrupting trade and creating perilous conditions on the seas. Torpedoes, mines, and underwater ambushes introduced a new dimension to war, invisible yet lethal. Merchant sailors and naval crews adapted quickly, developing convoy systems, evasive maneuvers, and signaling strategies to survive. The interplay between technology and human strategy defined much of the naval conflict, with ordinary sailors navigating new dangers daily. Even communications technology advanced. Telephones, telegraphs, and carrier pigeons were supplemented by field radios. Commanders relied on rapid communication to coordinate artillery, infantry, and reconnaissance. Signalers risked life and limb carrying messages through shell fire. Disrupted communications could turn planned offensives into disasters. Innovation was not only about creating new weapons but ensuring that armies could operate efficiently under constant stress. Medical technology, too, evolved under necessity. The scale of injuries demanded rapid treatment, surgical improvisation, and triage systems. Ambulances, often motorized, transported wounded soldiers to field hospitals. Doctors learned new techniques to treat fractures, amputations, and infections. X-ray machines were deployed to locate bullets and shrapnel, and antiseptic practices were enforced to combat gangrene and sepsis. Despite these advances, mortality remained high, and medical staff faced immense physical and emotional burdens. For ordinary soldiers, technological innovation was both blessing and curse. Guns, tanks, and planes offered protection and support, yet also introduced new threats. Each development changed tactics, survival strategies, and daily routines. Soldiers learned to dig deeper, move faster, anticipate chemical attacks, and endure the psychological weight of mechanized destruction. Technology magnified the scale of war, turning landscapes, bodies, and communities into instruments and targets alike. And yet, human resilience persisted. Soldiers shared knowledge about gas masks, improvised camouflage, and artillery avoidance. Nurses, medics, and doctors innovated in care, often improvising with limited supplies. Communities adapted to shortages of coal, steel, and labor, contributing indirectly to the technological arms race. Even in the face of overwhelming machines, ordinary people found ways to endure, survive, and sometimes even help others. Consider this: when the tools of war grow faster, deadlier, and more impersonal than ever before, how do humans maintain courage, ingenuity, and hope amidst explosions, gas, and relentless firepower? How do ordinary men and women navigate a world transformed by technology, where survival depends on skill, luck, and constant adaptation? As you lift your eyes from the mud, trenches, and steel of the ground, you find yourself looking upward to a theater that was still new, terrifying, and full of potential: the sky. Before the First World War, flight was a novelty, a daring experiment. By 1914, it had become a critical arena of warfare, where courage, technology, and innovation collided above the battlefield. For the soldiers below, planes became both spies and hunters, silent shadows that could change the course of a battle or turn the tide of an offensive. At the beginning, aircraft were primarily used for reconnaissance. Soldiers in the trenches would watch for tiny silhouettes crossing the horizon, carrying messages, observing enemy positions, and photographing troop movements. The information gathered from these flights was invaluable. It allowed commanders to direct artillery more accurately, anticipate attacks, and assess enemy strength. Yet these reconnaissance missions were perilous. Pilots faced anti-aircraft fire, enemy aircraft, and the unpredictable behavior of early machines. Every flight carried the risk of death, mechanical failure, or capture behind enemy lines. As the war progressed, planes evolved into fighters and bombers. Dogfights, a term coined for the aerial duels that emerged, became deadly contests of skill, reflex, and nerve. Pilots maneuvered wooden, canvas-covered planes through clouds of smoke, fire, and bullets. They learned to aim while balancing altitude, wind, and engine power. A single miscalculation could send a plane spiraling into the ground or water. Combat in the air was intense, personal, and immediate. Unlike artillery or gas, which struck from distance, the pilot faced an opponent one-on-one, or sometimes in small squadrons, with life hanging in the balance. Strategic bombing also emerged, changing not only military tactics but civilian life. Germany conducted raids over Britain, dropping bombs on cities like London, Hull, and Scarborough. Civilians had never experienced warfare in the sky before. The sight of falling bombs, the sound of explosions, and the fear of destruction became a daily reality. Air raid sirens, shelters, and blackout curtains became part of normal life. People learned to navigate fear in new dimensions, and communities adapted quickly to survive. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, aircraft were integrated into combined arms strategies. Reconnaissance planes identified enemy positions, relayed information, and marked targets for artillery. Observation balloons, tethered above the lines, provided a stationary view of the battlefield, though they were vulnerable to attack. Pilots risked both mechanical failure and enemy fire, and the work required not only courage but technical knowledge and ingenuity. Observers often carried cameras and maps, documenting positions while their plane wobbled under fire or in high winds. Technology advanced rapidly in aviation. Machine guns were mounted on planes, synchronized to fire through the propeller without destroying it. Aircraft became faster, more maneuverable, and better armed. Bombs grew in size and precision, and pilots developed formation flying to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk. Engineers experimented with new engines, lightweight materials, and aerodynamics. For ordinary soldiers and civilians, these technological shifts were felt as increased danger from above and a growing awareness that the sky itself was no longer safe or neutral. The psychological impact on pilots was immense. Life expectancy for a novice fighter pilot could be measured in weeks. Constant vigilance, rapid decision-making, and the stress of combat above friendly or enemy lines created a unique form of mental strain. Many pilots wrote letters describing the mixture of exhilaration, fear, and isolation. While trenches were filled with comrades, aircraft carried men alone, responsible for their survival and the success of missions that could affect entire battles. Civilians adapted to these threats in ways that mirrored their resilience on the home front. Shelters were dug, windows reinforced, and community drills organized. Children were taught to recognize the sound of engines and the signal of bombs. Civilians rationed resources not just for survival, but to maintain morale, knowing that the war in the air could strike at any moment. Letters often included accounts of air raids, capturing both fear and curiosity, as ordinary people attempted to make sense of this unprecedented form of warfare. The war in the air also influenced culture and society. Newspapers published stories of ace pilots, whose bravery became legendary. Photographs and illustrations depicted daring maneuvers, dogfights, and aerial victories. These stories inspired recruits, maintained morale, and created heroes in a time when ground combat could seem anonymous and relentless. Posters encouraged patriotism, often celebrating pilots as symbols of technological mastery and personal courage. Despite the glamour sometimes associated with flying, the reality was harsh. Pilots suffered from frostbite at high altitudes, fatigue from long hours of vigilance, and exposure to engine fumes and oil. Mechanical failures were common, and parachutes were not yet standard equipment. Every mission carried risk, yet men flew repeatedly, motivated by duty, camaraderie, or a desire for adventure and recognition. Their endurance and skill contributed to the evolving strategies of war and influenced the design of future aircraft. Training became critical. Schools and programs were established to prepare pilots for the technical and tactical demands of aerial combat. Instruction included mechanics, navigation, signaling, and gunnery. Cadets practiced maneuvers for hours, learning to anticipate enemy movements and respond instinctively. This combination of technical skill, strategic thinking, and courage was rare, and those who succeeded became invaluable assets on the front. Observation and intelligence remained central. Reconnaissance missions provided maps, documented troop movements, and identified targets for artillery. Pilots and observers carried cameras, binoculars, and notebooks, documenting every detail. Mistakes could be fatal. Misread coordinates, delayed reports, or mechanical failure could lead to disastrous results. The integration of aerial intelligence into battlefield planning represented a major shift in the conduct of war, emphasizing information as power. Air warfare also connected to the larger technological ecosystem. Tanks, artillery, and infantry all depended on aerial observation for timing and coordination. Communication between aircraft and ground forces grew increasingly sophisticated, with signal flags, lights, and radio systems allowing real-time coordination. The battlefield became a multi-dimensional space, where success depended on synchronizing land, sea, and air operations. Innovation did not stop with machines. Pilots developed tactics to maximize survival and effectiveness, flying in formations, executing evasive maneuvers, and attacking in coordinated waves. Dogfights demanded situational awareness, understanding wind, altitude, and the limitations of aircraft. Ordinary soldiers watched these aerial duels, aware that the sky was no longer just open space, but a dynamic battlefield where every movement could determine life or death. Civilian adaptation mirrored the resilience seen in other areas. Air raid shelters, early warning systems, and emergency response teams were created. Schools taught children to remain calm under the sound of sirens. Communities organized drills and maintained communication networks to respond to attacks. While the technological spectacle of air warfare inspired awe, it also reinforced the constant presence of danger, bringing the war into daily life even far from the front. And yet, amidst the fear and destruction, moments of human endurance and ingenuity persisted. Pilots shared knowledge, repaired machinery under pressure, and relied on camaraderie to survive. Civilians maintained routines, adapted to rationing and threat, and sought comfort in community and humor. The war in the air was a theater of both destruction and resilience, innovation and adaptation, reflecting the larger reality of a conflict that encompassed every aspect of human experience. Consider this: when the very skies above you become a battlefield, when death and destruction can descend silently from above, how do humans continue to function, to adapt, and to find courage in a world where danger can arrive from any direction, at any moment? As you move away from the chaos of battlefields and the roar of artillery, you enter a quieter, yet no less deadly, theater of war, the world of intelligence. Espionage and code-breaking were the invisible weapons of the First World War, shaping strategy, revealing secrets, and determining outcomes without a single shot being fired. Here, ordinary people, clerks, mathematicians, secret agents, and even children could hold the fate of entire armies in their hands, often without ever leaving their offices or safe houses. At the start of the war, military communication relied heavily on telegrams, letters, and runners. Messages were transmitted between commanders, units, and governments, but in every line of communication lay the potential for interception. Nations quickly realized that controlling information could be as decisive as controlling territory. Messages in code, disguised as innocent correspondence, became lifelines for strategy. Soldiers and civilians alike could unwittingly carry secrets that, if revealed, might cost thousands of lives. Germany, Britain, France, and Russia all invested heavily in espionage networks. Spies were deployed across enemy territory, often posing as merchants, journalists, or even refugees. They observed troop movements, monitored railway schedules, and reported on supply lines. Some were trained in subtlety, slipping notes into seemingly mundane correspondence, photographing documents, or memorizing layouts of fortifications. The risk was immense. Capture often meant execution, imprisonment, or forced labor. Yet, despite the danger, intelligence work became essential, shaping decisions at the highest levels. One of the most famous intelligence stories of the war involved the interception of the Zimmermann telegram in 1917. German officials sent a coded message to Mexico, proposing an alliance against the United States in exchange for land lost in previous conflicts. British codebreakers intercepted and deciphered the telegram, revealing Germany's intentions. The publication of this information helped shift American public opinion, ultimately influencing the United States to enter the war. A single piece of intelligence, transmitted quietly and decoded with care, altered the trajectory of a global conflict. Code breaking was an intricate and meticulous art. Cryptographers worked in dimly lit rooms, deciphering messages using pattern recognition, substitution methods, and early statistical analysis. Some codes were simple, relying on substitution or transposition, but others employed multiple layers of encryption. Breaking them required patience, logic, and creativity. Clerks and mathematicians, often young men and women, labored for hours to uncover patterns that could reveal enemy movements, supply schedules, or strategic intentions. Every breakthrough could save thousands of lives. Espionage was not limited to letters and codes. Photographic reconnaissance, using cameras mounted on aircraft, balloons, and even pigeons, provided visual intelligence. Analysts would study images of trenches, fortifications, and supply depots, mapping enemy positions and assessing vulnerabilities. This was painstaking work. Clouds, shadows, or the smallest error in interpretation could lead to miscalculations, turning planned offensives into disasters. Yet success meant precise targeting, better coordination, and more effective operations. Civilians also played unexpected roles in intelligence. Postal workers, railway employees, and merchants sometimes became unwitting couriers or observers. Ordinary letters, train schedules, or even casual conversations could contain valuable information. Nations relied on observation networks, sometimes enlisting people who had no formal military training but keen eyes and good memory. Survival in these circumstances often depended not on guns, but on discretion, observation, and judgment. Espionage also had a human dimension. Spies needed nerves of steel, the ability to lie convincingly, and quick thinking under pressure. They often lived double lives, forming false identities to move freely across enemy lines. Relationships, friendships, and even family ties could be manipulated or sacrificed for intelligence purposes. Diaries and memoirs reveal the constant tension, the fear of exposure, and the psychological toll of living in perpetual uncertainty. Every encounter could be a trap, every misstep a death sentence. Code breaking extended beyond enemy communications. Propaganda and misinformation campaigns required careful analysis to detect deception. Nations attempted to manipulate each other's perception, feeding false intelligence to mislead strategic planning. Analysts had to distinguish between genuine and fabricated reports, often under severe time pressure. Mistakes could lead to disastrous offensives, wasted resources, and unnecessary loss of life. Intelligence work was not only about gathering information but interpreting it with precision. The use of intelligence also shaped battles in subtle but powerful ways. At the Somme, Verdun, and Tannenberg, commanders relied on intercepted communications, aerial reconnaissance, and local informants to plan attacks and counterattacks. Timing, supply allocation, and troop movements were often dictated by the quality of information rather than sheer force. In some instances, a single intercepted message allowed one side to ambush another, turning an expected defeat into a temporary victory. Intelligence networks were global. Agents operated across Europe, the Middle East, and even in the Americas. Diplomatic staff, expatriates, and sympathizers provided information, coordinated movements, and facilitated communication. Each network was a web of observation, reporting, and analysis. The smallest node, an ordinary clerk translating a telegram, a farmer noticing troop movements, or a railway worker reporting shipments, could influence decisions at the highest level. Ordinary people, often unknowingly, became part of the machinery of war. Training and organization were critical. Governments established dedicated intelligence services, teaching cryptography, surveillance, counterintelligence, and covert operations. Officers and operatives learned how to read enemy behavior, detect deception, and communicate securely. The work was relentless, often isolated, and mentally exhausting. Yet the contributions of these individuals frequently determined the success of entire campaigns, highlighting the vital interplay between human skill and technological or procedural innovation. Even in occupied territories, resistance movements acted as informal intelligence networks. Civilians reported on enemy activity, sabotaged supply lines, and relayed information to Allied forces. These acts were small, often invisible, yet cumulatively significant. A message slipped under a door, a coded signal from a window, or a discreet observation could alter the outcome of a battle far away. Survival and impact often depended on subtlety, discretion, and courage in the face of severe consequences. Espionage and code breaking also had lasting effects on post-war society. Many of the techniques, organizations, and practices developed during the First World War laid the groundwork for modern intelligence agencies. Cryptography advanced rapidly, creating new branches of science and analysis. The war demonstrated that information, carefully gathered and interpreted, could be as decisive as rifles, artillery, or ships. Knowledge itself became a weapon, wielded quietly but effectively. And yet, despite the sophistication of networks, success was never guaranteed. Mistakes, misinterpretations, and betrayal could reverse advantage instantly. The human element, judgment, observation, intuition, remained crucial. Ordinary people, whether clerks, farmers, soldiers, or civilians, shaped the course of intelligence efforts through observation, discretion, and sometimes sheer chance. In a war dominated by mechanized violence, human perception and ingenuity continue to matter profoundly. Consider this: when battles are won and lost, not by bullets but by messages, codes, and hidden observations, how do ordinary humans navigate a world where knowledge itself is both a weapon and a liability? How do you, standing quietly behind the lines, influence events you may never see, yet which determine life, death, and history itself? As you leave the familiar trenches and open battlefields, you enter towns, villages, and countryside, now marked not by artillery craters, but by occupation. The First World War was not only a clash of armies, it was a collision of societies, where ordinary civilians and soldiers met in tense, fragile, and often dangerous ways. Occupied territories became zones of survival, negotiation, and adaptation, where daily life existed alongside fear, restriction, and uncertainty. Germany, France, Belgium, and other regions experienced prolonged periods of occupation. Soldiers, often billeted in civilian homes or commandeering public buildings, imposed military authority over local populations. Daily routines of civilians were disrupted. Shops faced rationing or seizure of goods. Farms were requisitioned for military use. Roads and transportation networks prioritized troop movement over civilian needs. Ordinary people adapted quickly, improvising to maintain food, water, and shelter, while navigating the constant presence of armed men in their midst. For soldiers, occupying a territory was a different kind of warfare. Unlike the front lines, the threat came not only from enemy attacks, but from tension with local populations, disease, and logistical challenges. They had to enforce rules, maintain order, and extract resources without provoking rebellion. Discipline was enforced rigorously, yet soldiers often relied on cooperation with civilians for survival. Relationships, both tense and pragmatic, developed between occupiers and the occupied, with trust and suspicion coexisting uneasily. Civilians employed a range of strategies to survive. Some complied openly, obeying curfews, requisition orders, and labor demands to avoid punishment. Others practiced subtle resistance, hiding supplies, providing false information, or assisting enemy spies. Children often played roles in maintaining communication or observation networks, carrying messages or signaling movements. Survival demanded creativity, discretion, and courage in circumstances that could change at any moment. The psychological impact on both groups was significant. Civilians lived under constant fear of violence, seizure of property, or deportation. Soldiers, in turn, faced stress from maintaining authority, executing orders, and confronting the human consequences of occupation. The moral complexity of these interactions, balancing duty, survival, and empathy, defined much of the daily reality in occupied territories. Ordinary people were forced into roles where every choice could have life or death consequences. Food scarcity was a persistent issue. Requisitioning often left civilians with barely enough to survive. Local markets collapsed or operated under strict control. Families developed intricate networks to share resources, barter, or hide supplies. Soldiers, too, relied on local knowledge to obtain food, water, and shelter, creating a precarious interdependence. Meals became not only sustenance but a matter of strategy, secrecy, and negotiation. Cultural and religious practices continued, but with restrictions. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings were curtailed or adapted. In some cases, Civilians used rituals as subtle acts of resistance, preserving traditions in secret or modifying them to avoid attention. Schools often became sites of indirect influence, with curriculum controlled or censored by occupying forces. Children learned both ordinary lessons and the lessons of survival under occupation. Observation, caution, and adaptability. Labor demands intensified. Civilians were often compelled to work for the occupying army, repairing roads, constructing fortifications, or manufacturing supplies. These tasks were dangerous, exhausting, and morally complex. Resistance could mean punishment, while compliance could mean contributing to the very forces that disrupted daily life. Ordinary people navigated this tension continuously, balancing survival with ethical considerations. Communication became a lifeline and a source of danger. Letters, clandestine networks, and oral messages allowed families to maintain contact, share information, and coordinate survival strategies. Soldiers, too, relied on accurate communication to manage relationships, maintain order, and coordinate operations. Errors, miscommunication, or intercepted messages could lead to dire consequences. Ordinary people became both participants and observers in an invisible war of information, perception, and negotiation. Health and hygiene were constant concerns. Occupation strained access to clean water, medical care, and nutrition. Disease could spread rapidly, exacerbated by overcrowded living conditions and disrupted services. Both civilians and soldiers faced the challenge of maintaining health in precarious circumstances. Hospitals, when available, were overburdened, and ordinary people often improvised treatments at home, relying on local knowledge, herbal remedies, or ingenuity. Survival depended on vigilance, resourcefulness, and sometimes sheer luck. The psychological landscape of occupied territories was shaped by uncertainty. Every encounter, whether with soldiers, neighbors, or authorities, carried risk. Civilians developed acute awareness, reading gestures, tone, and context to anticipate threats. Soldiers, similarly, had to judge intentions and reactions to maintain control while avoiding escalation. Ordinary human perception became a critical tool in navigating a landscape dominated by power, fear, and fragility. Resistance movements emerged, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes organized. Civilians provided intelligence, sabotaged supplies, and assisted escaped prisoners. Even small acts hiding food, signaling troop movements, or falsifying documents could have significant consequences. These efforts were dangerous but also a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and the drive to assert agency in situations of extreme vulnerability. Religion, art, and small rituals became tools for endurance. Civilians sought solace in faith, music, storytelling, and simple routines. Soldiers sometimes participated, either out of genuine belief or as a method to maintain morale. In occupied towns, life continued in subtle, quiet ways. Children played in streets when possible, families shared stories, and communities adapted celebrations to avoid drawing attention. These acts, seemingly ordinary, were essential for psychological survival. Gender roles shifted under occupation. Women often took responsibility for family survival, managing resources, maintaining farms, and caring for children while negotiating with occupying forces. Men, when not conscripted or deployed, engaged in resistance, labor, or negotiation with soldiers. Children observed, learned, and contributed in subtle ways. Occupation transformed traditional roles, forcing ordinary people to adapt, cooperate, or resist under new and challenging conditions. The cumulative effect of occupation on ordinary life was profound. Daily routines, social structures, and individual psychology were all shaped by the constant presence of armed forces. Every decision, from cooking a meal to sending a letter, could carry risk or consequence. Yet amidst fear and scarcity, human resilience persisted. Communities adapted, negotiated, and innovated, finding ways to maintain continuity, hope, and connection. And here is the question I leave you with. When your town, your home, and your daily life are controlled by foreign soldiers, how do you continue to live, adapt, and preserve a sense of identity and agency, knowing that every action could carry consequences beyond your control? As you step back from the front lines and occupied towns, you realize that not all battles were fought with rifles, artillery, or gas. Some were waged in minds, hearts, and perceptions. The First World War introduced modern psychological warfare on a massive scale. Governments, militaries, and media understood that victory depended not only on material strength but on morale, loyalty, and the ability to shape beliefs. Ordinary people, whether soldiers in trenches or civilians in cities, became the audience and targets of this relentless campaign. Propaganda emerged as a pervasive force. Posters, newspapers, pamphlets, and public speeches sought to mold perception and behavior. In Britain, colourful and often emotive posters encouraged enlistment, rationing, and support for the war effort. Images of heroic soldiers, patriotic flags, and idealized depictions of victory were everywhere. One iconic poster famously depicted a pointing soldier declaring, "Your country needs you," a direct appeal to duty and personal responsibility. Citizens were called upon to be heroes at home, just as soldiers were at the front. Germany, too, relied heavily on propaganda. The government issued materials emphasizing honor, duty, and national unity. Posters depicted soldiers as valiant defenders of the fatherland, while emphasizing the threat posed by enemies. Newspapers, censored and curated, highlighted victories and minimized setbacks. Civilians were encouraged to conserve resources, support the war financially, and trust official narratives. Ordinary people, navigating scarcity and fear, found themselves participants in a carefully orchestrated psychological effort. Propaganda targeted not only adults but children. Schools incorporated lessons about patriotism, loyalty, and the importance of supporting soldiers. Students were encouraged to contribute through scrap drives, gardening, and letter writing. Even seemingly mundane acts became framed as patriotic duty. Children absorbed messages that shaped understanding of the war, responsibility, and the value of sacrifice. Education became both a tool of knowledge and a subtle mechanism of influence. Morale was not only a civilian concern. Soldiers, facing relentless bombardment, gas attacks, mud, and disease, were constantly reminded of the purpose and significance of their struggle. Military authorities distributed newsletters, organized concerts, and promoted rituals to sustain psychological resilience. Letters from home were carefully encouraged, as they reminded men of connections, love, and life beyond the battlefield. Morale, both fragile and crucial, became a strategic consideration in warfare. Censorship intertwined with propaganda. Governments monitored letters, newspapers, and public discourse, shaping what information reached citizens and soldiers. Reports of defeats were minimized, casualty numbers often underreported, and enemy atrocities emphasized. Control of information allowed authorities to maintain a narrative of inevitability and righteousness, even amid staggering losses. Ordinary people were asked to trust the filtered lens through which they viewed the world. Psychological tactics extended to the enemy. Leaflets dropped from aircraft, falsified documents, and rumors spread uncertainty, fear, and doubt. Soldiers were targeted with messages designed to undermine confidence, encourage surrender, or provoke dissent. Civilian populations received appeals intended to reduce resistance, encourage cooperation, or incite unrest. The war became as much about perception and belief as about physical confrontation. Humor and satire also played roles in shaping morale. Cartoons, humorous letters, and songs allowed people to process fear and hardship, sometimes subtly critiquing authority while maintaining resilience. Dark humor, grim jokes about death and injury, and ironic commentary on bureaucracy provided psychological relief. Ordinary people, both soldiers and civilians, used humor as a coping mechanism, creating space for humanity amidst chaos. Media played a critical role in shaping perceptions of progress and heroism. Photographs of battles, portraits of soldiers, and images of destroyed towns were selectively published. Newspapers emphasized bravery, resilience, and strategic victories. Ordinary citizens absorbed these messages, often without the ability to verify them. The interplay between media, perception, and reality shaped expectations, decisions, and emotional endurance across the war zone and home front. Propaganda also reinforced social norms and roles. Women were encouraged to support men at the front, maintain households, and work in industries. Men were exhorted to fight bravely and uphold honor. Children were socialized into patriotism, obedience, and civic responsibility. These messages, reinforced daily, shaped behavior, expectations, and identity. Ordinary people navigated these expectations while balancing survival, fear, and personal values. The impact on morale was profound. Soldiers facing the horrors of trench warfare, machine guns, and gas relied on psychological reinforcement to endure. Civilians confronting scarcity, displacement, and occupation drew strength from collective narratives, shared rituals, and patriotic appeals. Propaganda was not merely informational, it was performative, shaping behavior, belief, and emotional resilience. Human perception, interpretation, and response became crucial components of survival. Internationally, propaganda influenced alliances, diplomacy, and public opinion. Stories of enemy atrocities, heroic battles, and patriotic sacrifice were disseminated across borders. Neutral nations monitored these narratives, sometimes swayed in policy and perception. Ordinary people, reading newspapers or hearing speeches, became participants in a global network of belief, perception, and judgment. Their understanding of events, often filtered through bias and selective information, shaped both personal and collective actions. Art and literature contributed subtly. Poems, songs, and novels reflected experiences of war while reinforcing themes of courage, sacrifice, and endurance. Some works were overtly patriotic, others deeply critical. Civilians and soldiers absorbed these cultural products, drawing guidance, reflection, or consolation. Ordinary people interacted with both formal propaganda and cultural storytelling, weaving personal understanding from a mixture of instruction, persuasion, and reflection. The persistence of propaganda underscores a key aspect of the First World War, that battles extended far beyond the trenches. Psychological resilience, perception management, and information control became instruments of warfare. Ordinary people, navigating daily life, scarcity, and fear, were constantly participants in an invisible, yet pervasive, campaign to shape belief, morale, and behavior. The human mind, it became clear, was both a target and a tool of conflict. Even small acts mattered. Civilians sharing truthful information, soldiers questioning narratives, or children repeating slogans could influence collective perception. Ordinary humans were nodes in a vast network of communication, interpretation, and action. Understanding, skepticism, and judgment became survival skills. The line between propaganda and reality blurred, leaving everyone to navigate uncertainty, trust, and the consequences of belief. And so, consider this. When every poster, newspaper, and letter is crafted to shape your mind, to guide your thoughts and actions, how do you maintain perspective, morale, and agency? When belief itself becomes a weapon, how do ordinary people discern reality, find courage, and continue to endure amidst relentless psychological pressure? As you step into the quiet that followed the cannons, you realize that the First World War did not truly end with treaties or armistices. The world it left behind was scarred, transformed, and profoundly altered, and ordinary people, soldiers returning from the front, civilians rebuilding homes, and families mourning lost loved ones were left to navigate this new reality. What had once been daily life, routines, and communities had been disrupted, reshaped, and in some cases destroyed leaving human resilience as the key to survival. The physical landscape was a constant reminder of the war's devastation. Cities and villages had been flattened by artillery, factories burned, and farmland poisoned or abandoned. Trenches scarred the countryside, filled with rusting equipment, and the memories of battles fought relentlessly. For ordinary people, returning home meant confronting the ruins of places that had once been familiar. Rebuilding demanded effort, ingenuity, and cooperation, as communities sought to restore homes, farms, roads, and public services in a landscape littered with remnants of destruction. Economically, the post-war period was precarious. Nations faced staggering debts, disrupted trade, and devastated industries. Currency devaluations, inflation, and unemployment affected ordinary people directly. Families who had once relied on stable wages or agricultural output now had to adapt to uncertainty, inventing new ways to survive. Markets reopened slowly, often dependent on imports or aid. Ordinary citizens became inventors and entrepreneurs, improvising solutions to shortages and economic instability. Survival required creativity, patience, and flexibility. Socially, the war accelerated profound changes. Women, who had contributed massively to industrial work, agriculture, and health services, gained new visibility and political influence. In some nations, suffrage expanded, and women increasingly participated in professions previously reserved for men. Soldiers returning from the front had to reintegrate into a society transformed by absence, while children matured in a world shaped by scarcity and loss. Ordinary life was redefined, with families, communities, and gender roles evolving under the pressures of history. The psychological aftermath was perhaps the most enduring challenge. Soldiers suffered from what was then called shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Civilians, too, carried trauma from occupation, displacement, and bombardment. Memories of suffering, deprivation, and loss lingered long after physical wounds healed. Communities coped through rituals, storytelling, and commemoration, finding ways to honor the dead, mourn the missing, and make sense of what had been endured. Ordinary people bore the invisible scars alongside the tangible ones, reshaping their identities in a world forever altered. Memorials, ceremonies, and monuments became central to collective memory. Cities and towns erected statues, plaques, and memorial gardens to honor soldiers and civilians lost during the conflict. Ordinary people participated in remembrance, attending services, decorating graves, and preserving letters and photographs. These acts were both cathartic and instructive, reinforcing continuity, community bonds, and an understanding of history as a living narrative rather than a distant event. Education also adapted. Schools incorporated lessons on patriotism, sacrifice, and the consequences of war, sometimes revisiting events with a critical perspective. Ordinary children learned not only traditional subjects but also the broader history of conflict, human endurance, and societal change. Education became a means to transmit memory, instill awareness, and encourage reflection, connecting personal experience with larger historical forces. Internationally, the map of Europe and the Middle East was redrawn. New nations emerged, empires collapsed, and borders shifted. Ordinary people had to navigate these geopolitical changes, often finding themselves under new authorities or in different nations overnight. Citizenship, identity, and legal status became daily concerns, requiring adaptation, negotiation, and a recalibration of relationships and allegiances. Every life, however small or ordinary, was touched by these vast political movements. Economically, the war accelerated technological and industrial shifts. Factories that had produced weapons transitioned to consumer goods, transport infrastructure rebuilt, and innovations such as mechanized agriculture and communications expanded. Ordinary people benefited from some of these advances but also bore the burden of rapid adaptation. Labor markets changed, and skills acquired during wartime service or industry became central to post-war economies. Life was a delicate balance between opportunity and uncertainty. Health and welfare became pressing concerns. Influenza pandemics, malnutrition, and injuries left lasting impacts on populations. Governments, charities, and communities worked to provide medical care, rebuild hospitals, and develop public health systems. Ordinary people relied on local knowledge, familial support, and community networks to navigate these challenges. Survival and recovery demanded cooperation, resilience, and ingenuity on both the personal and societal level. Culturally, the war inspired reflection, art, and literature. Soldiers wrote memoirs and poems, artists depicted devastation and heroism, and journalists documented the human experience of conflict. Ordinary people engaged with these cultural products, finding reflection, solace, or lessons in them. Art and literature became a bridge between personal experience and collective memory, preserving insights into endurance, adaptation, and human resilience. The legacies of the war were both cautionary and instructive. Ordinary people learned the fragility of peace, the cost of technological escalation, and the significance of governance, communication, and social cohesion. Communities discovered the importance of preparedness, adaptation, and resilience in times of crisis. Every rebuilt home, re-established farm, and recovered city became a testament to human endurance. Ordinary lives, small choices, and quiet perseverance collectively shaped the world that emerged from destruction. Even decades later, the echoes of the First World War influenced politics, culture, and daily life. Veterans associations, commemorative practices, and historical study ensured that the experiences of ordinary people were not forgotten. Education, memorials, and storytelling allowed lessons to pass from generation to generation. Human endurance, courage, and adaptation became central themes, shaping not only memory but the continuing trajectory of societies. As you reflect on the aftermath, you see that history is never solely about generals, treaties, or battles. It is about ordinary humans, navigating fear, scarcity, and uncertainty, yet finding ways to endure, adapt, and rebuild. It is about communities that persevere amidst devastation, about families that sustain love and hope, and about individuals whose resilience echoes across time. Every ordinary act of survival contributes to the collective memory and enduring lessons of history. And so, you are left with a final thought. When the smoke clears, when treaties are signed, and when peace is declared, how do ordinary people carry forward their lives, their identities, and their communities in a world irreversibly transformed by conflict? How do you, having witnessed the unprecedented scale of human endurance and suffering, find the courage to rebuild, to adapt, and to continue shaping the course of history, one ordinary life at a time?